Okay, I want you to picture the early 20th century, but don't think of it like a chapter in a history book. Think of it like a massive multi-car pileup on a dark highway. The old world, with all its ideas of order and progress, it's just flatlined. This isn't just history, it's an emergency room. And in the middle of all this chaos, a poet named W.B. Yeats picks up a pen that might as well be a scalpel. He's not just writing poetry, he's performing an autopsy on a dying age. So let's see what he found. This right here, this is the alarm bell. Yeats wrote these words in 1919, and they're not just a poem. They're the definitive diagnosis for a civilization in the middle of a total breakdown. You could almost feel the very structures holding society together just groaning, about to shatter under a pressure they were never built to withstand. So that's really the central question we're digging into here. When all the systems we count on, political, social, even spiritual, start to just crumble, what's an artist supposed to do? Do they report from the wreckage, or do they try to save something beautiful from the fire? To really get Yeats, you have to see his time the way he saw it, as an emergency room. The poets of his day, they were the triage surgeons, forced to operate on a culture that was bleeding out from a dozen different wounds. This wasn't a time for quiet, thoughtful reflection. It was a time for desperate measures. And this is the birth of modernism. It wasn't just a new style of painting or some clever way of writing. No, it was like artistic CPR, a frantic, desperate response to a world where all the old certainties, that comfortable belief in a steady march of progress, had suddenly died on the operating table. And just look at the sheer velocity of this crisis. It was one body blow right after another. The Great War, a violent revolution in his own homeland of Ireland, the complete collapse of the Russian Empire, and then, on top of all of it, a devastating global pandemic. Any one of those events would have been world-changing. All of them together, it felt apocalyptic. And this is where Yeats comes in. You have to understand, he's this mystic, a guy completely steeped in the folklore and traditions of the old world, and he's suddenly forced to perform emergency surgery on this chaotic, fragmented new world. He's staring at a patient he barely even recognizes.
Now, here's what's so fascinating. Yeats, our surgeon, he makes two completely different choices. In one moment, he refuses to even scrub in, to enter the operating theater at all. And in another, he grabs a hospital intercom and announces a code blue for the entirety of Western civilization.
So let's start with that first choice, the surgeon's silence. It's 1915, right in the thick of World War I, and Yeats is asked to write a patriotic poem, for the war effort. And his response was a deep, deliberate, and pretty shocking refusal. This is his argument, right here. He's saying that in the deafening roar of war, a poem can't fix the carnage. To even try and set a statesman right, well, that just reduces art to political propaganda. It strips it of its real power. And his reasons were complex. Yeah, part of it was about protecting the integrity of poetry, but, and this is crucial, as an Irish nationalist living under British rule, he felt absolutely zero obligation to write propaganda for his colonizers' war. So here's the key takeaway. His silence wasn't passive. It was a powerful political act of resistance. Okay, but then just 4 years later, that calculated silence completely shatters. And it shatters into a primal scream. This brings us to his most famous work, The Second Coming. And here, he doesn't just enter the emergency room. He kicks down the doors and performs a terrifying public autopsy for the whole world to see. Now, to really understand this poem, we've got to look at it through 3 different lenses. First, there's the obvious political chaos. Then there's the way it twists religious myth. And then there's a third lens, a deeply personal one, that makes the horror of the poem feel so chillingly real. So the poem opens with this image of a widening gyre. This was Yeats's own personal theory of history. He saw it moving in these great spiraling cones, kind of like a tornado. He believed the 2,000-year cycle of Christianity was at its chaotic end, spinning so wide that, like a falcon flying too far from its master, it could no longer hear the call to come back. The center was gone. This big political and mystical chaos is terrifying enough, for sure. But there was something else happening right as Yeats was writing these lines. A private horror that gave the poem its raw emotional core. 70%. Let that sink in. That was the mortality rate for pregnant women who caught the Spanish flu. And as Yeats was writing The Second Coming in 1919, his own pregnant wife, Georgie, was literally fighting for her life against that very disease. And this just shows you how personal trauma can become universal art. The poem's famous line, the blood-dimmed tide, well, that wasn't just some poetic metaphor for war. One of the main symptoms of the 1918 flu was massive hemorrhaging. Patients were literally drowning in their own blood. And when you see it through this lens, the poem's famous rough beast is no longer just some political monster. It could be the virus itself, right? An invisible, indifferent force that kills without mercy, without ideology. It has a gaze that is blank and just utterly pitiless. So what does all this mean for us today? Well, the terrifying thing is that it feels like Yeats's emergency room has never really closed. His prognosis for the 20th century sounds unnervingly like a diagnosis for our 21st.
So you see, these two poems, they're not a contradiction. They are the two halves of the modern artist's dilemma. It's a dual mandate. You have to stare directly into the abyss and diagnose the horror with total clarity, but you also have to protect the fragile space of art from being totally consumed by that same horror. And this is maybe his most chillingly relevant diagnosis of all. He's describing the state of moral paralysis, where good people are just crippled by doubt and uncertainty, while the forces of destruction are energized by this fanatical, passionate intensity. Does that sound at all familiar?
The anxieties Yeats had about a collapsing center, about political polarization, about these unstoppable, faceless threats, they're our anxieties. He was writing about 1919, but he could just as easily be writing about today. Which leaves us with the exact same question he was facing. In a world that feels like it's in a constant state of emergency, what is the artist's role? Is it to get their hands dirty, to try and stitch up the wounds? Or is it to guard that one last sterile field where something like beauty or truth can still be preserved? That's the question Yeats leaves for all of us to answer.